Imagine being locked in a barn with your family and neighbors, then set on fire by Nazi soldiers. Imagine being starved and frozen in a besieged city, only to face the relentless onslaught of gunfire and bombings. This was the fate of many Russian women in World War II. Welcome to History on Fleek. Today we will explore the Nazi atrocities against Russian women and how they survived and resisted the horrors of war. Unbroken. If you were a Russian woman during World War II, you had two choices: stay at home and face the Nazi invasion, or to join the fight and defend your motherland. Many women chose the latter option and became part of the Soviet armed forces that fought against the German aggressors. Over 800,000 women served in various roles, from medics and nurses to pilots and snipers. They proved their courage, skill, and dedication in many battles and operations, often facing discrimination and hardship from their own comrades. They also suffered greatly from the enemy's brutality, losing their lives, limbs, and loved ones. Nearly 200,000 of them were decorated for their valor, and 89 of them received the highest honor of the Soviet Union, the Hero of the Soviet Union. These women made history as the first and only female combatants in a major war. They were not only soldiers, but also mothers, daughters, sisters, and wives. But being a Russian woman on the Eastern Front was a nightmare. Nazis viewed Soviet women as subhuman, subjecting them to extreme cruelty and violence. A systematic assault. German soldiers' behavior on the Eastern Front, sexual violence and abuse, objectification, dehumanization, all of these aspects paint a horrifying picture of the systematic sexual assault inflicted upon Russian women by German soldiers during World War II. The Nazis viewed it as a weapon of terror, using it to subjugate and destroy those they considered inferior. In their efforts to degrade and dehumanize Russian women, German soldiers subjected them to unimaginable acts of brutality. Women were treated as objects of desire, stripped of their dignity, and reduced to mere commodities. Shockingly, there were instances where women were publicly exposed and paraded, used for entertainment, or treated as spoils of war. Reports and testimonies from survivors shed light on the horrible acts committed by German soldiers. In some instances, captured partisan women and others were hot branded on bodies with derogatory Hitler labels and subjected to forced assault. The examples of mass violations against women committed by German soldiers compiled in the Molotov Note of 1942 served as a chilling testament to the widespread nature of these crimes. In the note, Vyacheslav Molotov points out the following: in Smolensk, a brothel was forcibly established for officers, where hundreds of women and girls were driven by arms and hair. The note also points out that young women from various villages were often captured and forcefully recruited to remove mines due to their lighter weight, which reduced the risk of triggering explosions. Disturbingly, the captors showed little regard for the lives lost in the process. Another incident mentioned in the note is the harrowing ordeal endured by the local Ukrainian actors in Kharkiv. On November 5, 1941, a chilling order was issued, demanding the immediate registration of all actors at the Shevchenko Theater. Obliging the order, when the actors arrived, they were surrounded by German soldiers, who harnessed them to carts and drove them through the most crowded streets, forcing them to haul water from the river. The intention behind this grotesque display was to degrade and demean the esteemed Ukrainian intellectuals. And most tragic of all, in Lviv, 32 women working in a garment factory were subjected to improper acts and then killed in a public park, while a priest who attempted to intervene and prevent the atrocity was also killed. The consequences of these assaults were devastating. It is estimated that over 1 million children were born to Russian women as a result of forced assaults by German soldiers. The scope of the atrocities is staggering. According to author Ursula Schelle, an estimated 1 in 10 women who were assaulted by German soldiers in the Soviet Union would have become pregnant. This suggests that the number of women potentially assaulted by the Wehrmacht could reach up to 10 million. Disturbingly, the occupying authorities only regarded these violations as a concern if they undermined military discipline. Though theoretically punishable by death since 1941, in practice, few cases were prosecuted. Assaults committed by Germans against non-German women were not taken seriously and often went unpunished. The laws on this kind of assault were changed in 1940, making it a petitioned crime that required punishment to be requested, resulting in a significant absence of prosecution and punishment. Shockingly, only one case was prosecuted by a German court during the military campaign in Poland. The guilty parties were sentenced for Rassenschande, racial defilement, according to Nazi Germany's racial policy, rather than for the act of the assault itself. These inconceivable acts reflect the depths of depravity to which German soldiers stooped during World War II. Sieges and pogroms. We have seen how the Nazi invaders used violence against Soviet women as a weapon of war, but these kind of assaults were not the only form of violence that the Nazis inflicted on the Soviet people. They also committed other horrific crimes, such as pogroms and sieges. They aimed to destroy the Soviet population, especially Jews, Slavs, Roma, and Communists. Let's explore a few prominent ones. The Khatyn Incident. The village of Khatyn in Belarus was a peaceful and prosperous community of 26 houses and 157 inhabitants. On March 22, 1943, this tranquility was shattered by the arrival of a Nazi battalion, composed mostly of Ukrainian collaborators. They were seeking revenge for an attack by Soviet partisans that killed 4 of their officers. They surrounded the village and ordered the villagers to gather in the central square. There, they separated the men from their families. They took the men to a nearby field and executed them one by one. Then they returned to the village and herded the families into a large barn. They poured gasoline on the straw roof and set it ablaze. The barn became a death trap for the terrified villagers. Only 6 people survived the massacre. Nazis did not spare them any mercy. They looted and burned the village to the ground. The Leningrad Siege. Another example of Nazi atrocities against Soviet civilians was the Siege of Leningrad, which lasted for 872 days from September 1941 to January 1944. The German army surrounded the city and cut off all its supplies and food, fuel, water, and electricity. They also bombarded the city relentlessly, killing thousands of people and destroying many buildings and monuments. The siege was part of Hitler's plan to wipe out Leningrad from the face of the earth and starve its population to death. The siege of Leningrad was a nightmare for its inhabitants, especially for women. They had to cope with the loss of their husbands, sons, brothers, or fathers who were fighting or lost in the war, while they had to protect themselves and their families from robbery and violence by desperate or criminal elements. The women of Leningrad also volunteered as nurses, firefighters, air raid wardens, or anti-aircraft gunners. The siege of Leningrad was one of the longest and most devastating sieges in history. It claimed the lives of over 1 million people. It also demonstrated the strength and heroism of the Soviet women who refused to give up or surrender to the Nazi enemy. The Minsk Ghetto was a Nazi-run enclosure in Belarus, where more than 100,000 Jews and other civilians were confined and killed. The ghetto was established in July 1941, shortly after the German invasion of the Soviet Union. The Jews of Minsk and nearby towns were forced to live in overcrowded and unsanitary conditions with little food, water, or medicine. They were subjected to brutal violence, forced labor, and constant raids by the Nazis and their collaborators. The women in the Minsk ghetto suffered particularly from the Nazi atrocities. Many of them were assaulted, punished, and executed by the Nazis and their collaborators. Some of them were also forced to work as slaves in brothels or camps. They witnessed their husbands, sons, brothers, fathers being deported to death camps. They also participated in acts of resistance and sabotage against the Nazi oppressors. The Minsk ghetto was liquidated in October 1943 after a series of mass executions and deportations by the Nazis. Only a few thousand Jews managed to survive the ghetto, mostly thanks to the resistance efforts. Forced labor and medical experiments. The Ravensbruck camp was a concentration camp for women located near Berlin. It was the largest and most notorious camp for women in Nazi Germany. More than 120,000 women from all over Europe were imprisoned there, but the majority of them were Russian. They faced brutal treatment, starvation, disease, punishment, and death. The camp was established in May 1939 as a place to detain female political prisoners, such as communists, socialists, and resistance fighters. Later, it also held Jewish women, Roma women, Jehovah's Witnesses, lesbians in particular, prostitutes, criminals, and asocials. The women came from Germany and Austria, and from all other European countries. However, over half of them came from the Soviet Union after being occupied by Nazi Germany. Exploitation was a central aspect of life in Ravensbruck. The SS and German companies saw the imprisoned women as a source of slave labor, forcing them to work in factories producing weapons, ammunition, textiles, and other goods for the Nazi war machine. They were also engaged in agricultural, construction, and maintenance work. These women toiled relentlessly, enduring grueling hours, meager rations, and deplorable conditions. The guards and overseers subjected them to regular beatings, whippings, kicks, and humiliating treatment. Sadly, many delicate souls died from exhaustion, malnutrition, or illness. In addition to forced labor, some women at Ravensbruck became victims of horrific medical experiments conducted by Nazi doctors. These procedures aimed to test various medical techniques and treatments. The women were subjected to surgeries and medical interventions without consent, which caused great physical harm. The toll of these experiments resulted in significant casualties and long-lasting disabilities. Ravensbruck was also a site of mass executions. Many women were sent to extermination camps like Auschwitz-Birkenau or Majdanek, where their lives were systematically extinguished. In the final months of the war, the killing intensified as the Nazis desperately sought to eliminate all evidence of their heinous crimes. The Soviet army finally liberated Ravensbrück on April 30, 1945. Tragically, only around 15% of the women who had been imprisoned there survived. The survivors were left to bear the physical and psychological scars of their ordeal for the remainder of their lives. This is History on Fleek, and we'll see you next time.